The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
America is free. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise, and freedom is special and rare.
This is Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides, a production of LibertyNation.com, going after what the politicians really mean and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
Children are being taught political agenda rather than the educational basics. Crime is through the roof with no sign of abating. And even getting your morning cup of coffee is becoming a problem as supply chains crumble. Are these indicators on the road to a very bad outcome? And what can we do to arrest these troubling trends? Well, welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides, and on today's show, we'll be covering the major topics: crime, kids, and supply chain disasters. We have a very special show for you today, and later on, we'll be talking with Carrie Lucas on how the Biden administration is hell-bent on getting indoctrination front and center in schools. I'd like to take a moment to wish a fond hello to our listeners out there in Chester Springs, Philadelphia on WFYL 1180 AM. Thanks for being here. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. It seems that the world is experiencing major supply chain disruption. Goods aren't being delivered, there's a backlog at ports, and consumers just aren't going to be able to get the goods that they want. What or who is to blame for this epic mismanagement? And is there a light at the end of the shipping container? Well, to help us get some of those answers, we're joined by economist and author, Mr. Andrew Moran. Welcome back to the show, Andrew.
Thank you for having me.
So tell me, we're seeing these issues worldwide. What is the, as the Biden administration is fond of saying, what is the root cause?
Well, of course, the root cause is COVID-19 and all the shutdowns that occurred. But in the aftermath, it's the main thing is that everyone is demanding everything at the same time. You know, now that the economy's reopening, coffee shops need coffee, automobile companies need their computer chips, businesses need energy, farmers need their feed. So what's even more fascinating is that you have all these other problems also springing up in some of these key markets. So Brazil, for instance, is just coming off one of its worst droughts in 90 years and has seriously disrupted its soybean harvest. Now, soybean harvest, one of its major customers is China, and China is scooping up all the soybean supply that's around the world, leaving very little for the rest of the world. So U.S. trying to make up for it, but it's still not enough. Chile is another good example. It's one of the biggest the biggest copper producer in the world, but its production has declined 5% this summer. Why? Because of constant work disruption. A lot of the workers, they're protesting. The unions are upset, so the supplies are keep being interrupted. Then you have, I think it was 14% down output from last year. So that's also another problem when you have all these stimulus projects occurring. And also, if I may say one more thing too, you have all these factors throughout the world occurring simultaneously. And back in the day, if you had a supply disruption in Chile, copper price would climb, let's say, a few basis points. Today, if there's a supply disruption in Chile, copper prices are going to surge 1 or 2%. So I find that interesting.
It appears to be the same problem globally, and yet globalists are choosing to lay their blame on their favorite bugbear. Why is that? Yeah.
I think the whole driver shortage is, as the British say, it's poppycock. I don't believe that whatsoever. But, there were, even before this whole energy crisis or this whole fuel shortage and apparent driver shortage happened, there were signs that Great Britain was going to endure an energy crisis because of falling inventories. I think in the UK, correct me if I'm wrong, about 40% of the nation's power is used from wind and solar and other renewable energy, if that's correct. And, the renewables have shown that it's not reliable and it's not enough to feed demand, especially in the post-COVID world. So the whole drivers thing is an excuse. If it were the drivers, how come other parts of Europe, as you say, is going through the same problem? China's going through the same problem. In northern China, the region's going through rolling blackouts because they don't have enough crude oil and natural gas. And what are they doing? They're transitioning to coal. And that's one thing funny about Europe too, is that Europe is supposed to be this green energy haven. They're investing in all these renewable projects, but what are they doing? They're shifting back to coal just to keep the lights on, just to power households and businesses. So it's going to be a disastrous winter. I just recorded something for my Swamponomics column talking about the looming energy crisis, and it's going to be terrible this winter if it's really cold in Europe and parts of Asia.
Yeah, it's one of those supply chain issues, especially in terms of fuel, because it's coming in a lot from Russia and Ukraine, thanks to the Nord Stream 2 pipeline that President Vladimir Putin managed to secure as a win from Joe Biden. Now, how is this supply chain specifically going to impact Americans, both in terms of what they can get and the dent to their wallets?
Well, companies, they're already warning shoppers that, you should get your Christmas shopping done now because the store shelves are going to be, quite limited, which you can see right now. You have the ship container crisis. It's such a huge premium. If you want to put your goods on one of these shipping containers, you're paying a massive premium. And then, of course, that cost is passed off on to the consumer, which would shock Jen Psaki at this moment. But also, when it comes to building the shipping containers, you can't build it fast enough. And if you build it, you're paying a massive amount of price because steel prices are trading at all-time highs. So it's gonna be quite problematic for American shoppers, not only around Christmas time, but from a lot of the estimates I've seen, it's going to impact until sometime late 2022. So I guess you have to prepare and start stocking up now on all your Tetley tea and all your crumpets. You have to start stockpiling on now.
Well, you mentioned 2022 and obviously late 2022, specifically when the midterms are due. This really seems like a bit of a recipe for disaster for the Democrats in power. But as Ronald Reagan said, the scariest words in the English language were, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." But is there anything that the federal government can actually do to solve this burgeoning crisis? Or have they done enough already?
Yeah, that when you say that line, it also makes me think of the Milton Friedman line when he said that if the government were in charge of the Sahara Desert, there would be a sand shortage within 7 days. But there isn't really anything the government can do about it. I mean, prices are gonna spike. So the only thing I can think of is that the government knows best is to spend money. So I've been writing about for months now that the Democrats are proposing a fourth stimulus check. So perhaps President Biden, he's going to say, you know what? Cost of living is sky high. You're having trouble, paying the bills or putting food in the fridge. So we're going to give you another $600 check. So that's the only thing I can think they're going to do. Aside from that, there's really nothing that they could respond to this, global issue.
What does the future hold for Americans, the near future? And you mentioned 2022, late 2022 for this to resolve itself. But in the short term, what's the situation?
I guess it's going to be bad. It's not going to be good. Because if you look at all the data, let's say you look at the PCE price index, you look at the CPI, the PPI, they're all sky high right now. They're all, the PCE price index is as high as it has been since May 1991. So that's not a good sign for the U.S. Economic recovery in the post-coronavirus world. So the main thing I would think right now, shortages are a problem, but when you get your hands on any of these goods, it's going to cost you an arm and a leg. It's going to be so tremendous, the cost, and it's only going to worsen as time goes by. And when Christmas comes, everyone's going to be demanding everything again, and it's going to be hard to get your hands on the latest pet rock toy set for your kids, because everyone's going to want it. So it's not going to look too pretty in the next few months. And then of course, I think energy is going to be the top issue this winter. As I've said before, in the United Kingdom, they're having an energy crisis. China's having an energy crisis. The U.S., I don't think it'll be too bad in the U.S. because the U.S. has so much oil and natural gas. So, but still, I mean, it's still going to be somewhat of a problem. But overall, it's not going to be a great few months. So I think that line, brace yourselves, winter is coming. So.
Thank you, Jon Snow. And I guess the natural gas and coal that could support the United States depends heavily upon Joe Biden being willing to let it come out of the ground. Andrew Moran, thank you ever so much.
Now, don't go anywhere. Later in the show, we'll be talking about the school indoctrination system and how Biden's big spending plans are only going to make it worse. But before that, after this short break, we'll be back with Lisa K. Donna to figure out why Austin, Texas is gripped in a crime wave that just won't quit.
For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
Last year, we saw the erroneously named Summer of Love spill out across mostly Democrat-led states in a flurry of violence and lawlessness. The police were hamstrung by cries of defund and accountability for racial justice. But what did it achieve? Like awakening from a bad hangover, cities across the country have found that their actions during that time have come back to haunt them, and none more so than Austin, Texas. Now, Liberty Nation editor-in-chief Lisa K. Donner has been following the story closely, and we're very, very lucky to have her on board today. Welcome, Lisa.
Hi, Mark. How are you?
I'm not too shabby. Care to give us a rundown of what's been happening in Austin, Texas?
Well, last year, the brilliant minds on the City Council of Austin, Texas, decided to take away $150 million from the police department budget.
What could possibly go wrong?
Exactly. So crime has gone up. Shocker, I know. As my husband and our Liberty Nation senior political analyst always says, one step thinking.
One step thinking, indeed. So they've had the crime rates go up, and now what's happening? What's the latest news?
All right, well, let's just delineate that. One of the Austin TV stations talked about comparing this year to date with 2017. Homicides are up 200%. I think I have the statistics here. Car theft up 77%. Assaults 36%. So this is a massive crime wave. This isn't just a little thing. I mean, people are really nervous. They're buying firearms for self-protection. That does not, taking away $150 million from the police department budget means you have to take away 911 for a lot of things. I mean, so they're telling people to dial 311 now.
So 311 is for something that you don't believe is life-threatening. Is that about right?
Right. So let's say there's a car accident with no injury, or maybe two people are fighting, but here's the thing. I think Americans are pretty conditioned that when there's an emergency, their brain fires 911. I mean, that's just the way it operates. I can't imagine people thinking, oh, what am I supposed to dial here? What's that number again? I mean, 311?
Yeah, there's a similar situation in the United Kingdom where all emergency calls used to be routed through 999, which is our equivalent of 911. But now they've got for non-urgent hospital emergencies, they have a different number. And sad to say, I don't know what that number is off the top of my head. So if I don't know it, I'm sure many others don't. So
well, that's my point exactly. That's exactly right. I mean, how are people going to remember, oh, no, I'm not supposed to call 999, like as you said in the UK. I'm supposed to call what?
Exactly. Now, let's talk about what the actual impact this is going to have on real people. So they have less police officers now, or there's a proposition going out, I believe it's called Proposition A, to hire more police officers per person. But that's about to get voted down, I think, because George Soros, of all people, the billionaire philanthropist and best friend to every left-leaning cause known to man, has decided to chuck $500,000 behind defeating it. What's that about?
Okay, I don't think it's fair to say that it's going to be defeated. I mean, he has put down $500,000, and we know that George Soros has really been trying to influence the criminal justice system in America. He's had several successes for getting DAs elected, most famously the very liberal DA in Philadelphia. But Proposition A basically says what the national federal government has said for years, which is 2 officers per 1,000 people. In other words, we can't go lower than that. And what's happening is the recidivism rate is really bad. And a lot of the officers are quitting or retiring early, and they don't have a police academy anymore. So, and it takes 2 years to get somebody up to speed to become a policeman.
Well, let's be fair, Lisa. After the 6th movie, that was just a no-go anyway. But yeah, so 2 officers per 1,000, that doesn't seem unreasonable. Now, far be it from Liberty Nation Radio to ever only present one side of the argument. The alternative is social workers. This is what's being promoted by, let's be honest, they're Democrat-led city councils around the country. They're asking for social officers or welfare workers to intercede so a situation doesn't become either criminalized or something that involves police presence. Now, my question, Lisa, is precisely how many social workers will die or get beaten before they decide this is a bad idea?
Well, this is a really bad idea. I can't imagine social workers wanting to go on the scene. And if you look at it, things like domestic violence calls, they tend to end in violence a lot. I mean, I don't have the statistic in front of me, but we've seen, was it in Chicago recently? I'm not sure what city it was, where the police officer pulled someone over, just a traffic stop, and just got blown away.
Yeah, these kind of things, they don't lend themselves to somebody who's got a degree in social sciences rather than somebody who's spent, and this is another part of Proposition A, I believe, is that it's further another 40 hours worth of training for the police officers. So people who are not trained in controlling a suspect, putting a suspect on the ground without using lethal force. These are serious things that I just can't see how serious people can consider these sensible solutions that will result in, let's be fair, saving lives.
Well, you take the firearms out of the law enforcement and correction hands, but who's taking the firearms out of the hands of the perpetrators?
Beto O'Rourke, apparently.
Yeah. When he gets rid of all our AR-15s, there'll be no more crime in America. Yeah, right.
So, Lisa, what is the solution?
Rudy Giuliani, way back when New York was really violent, he had the idea that little crimes lead to big crimes. And so he nailed people for little crimes. And lo and behold, what happened? New York City became a much safer place to live.
Yeah, it's called the broken window theory. And there's a lot of statistical data to back up that it's absolutely a working proposition. However, recent, let's call it narrative and spin from certain left-leaning news outlets have tried to cast aspersions on the idea of the broken window theory because they don't want small crimes punished because they see it as more of a racial justice issue because the more people that are arrested for it, they end up in prison, and they see that as over-criminalizing the world.
Well, it's interesting because now the New York Post had an interesting couple interesting paragraphs on this, and our own Joe Schaefer wrote about it in an article called "George Soros Adds to Austin Police Shortage Woes." So what we're doing is we're forget the little crimes. We're not even putting people away for big crimes. So he writes, this is from the New York Post. With 46 arrests for retail theft this year alone, this man of steel, STEAL, leads New York's record-shattering shoplifting surge. There's another guy, Isaac Rodriguez, 22, is called Sir Isaac Luton, the supervillain of heists. Then there's the King of Queens thieves, which have been arrested 57 times this year alone, including a vicious stabbing. If you're going to arrest these people and then just put them out on bail, they're going to keep doing what they're doing. Where is the deterrent?
Well, the one solution to that, Lisa, as Vice President Kamala Harris points out, is to end bail. Therefore, they don't have to pay bail before they're back out on the streets. So,
well, if you don't put anybody in jail for perpetrating crimes, the crime rate's going to go up.
Words of wisdom, words of fact from Lisa K. Donner, editor-in-chief of LibertyNation.com. Many thanks for being here, Lisa.
Thanks, Mark.
Coming up soon on the show, we'll be joined by Carrie Lucas of the Independent Women's Forum to tackle the critical race theory narrative wedded to the American school system. We'll be asking all the tough questions, but next, we're asking where the battle to make Washington, D.C., the 51st state, is heading. Don't touch that dial. You're listening to Liberty Nation Radio, heard across the Radio America network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. I want to say thank you to you for listening and give a special shout out to those of you listening on KBKW 103.5 FM, the talk of Grays Harbor, Washington.
America is free. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise, and freedom is special and rare.
This is Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides, a production of LibertyNation.com, going after what the politicians really mean and making it all clear for your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
Yet again, we see statehood for Washington, D.C. has become an issue. And with the Supreme Court making another ruling on this issue, we have to ask some serious questions about the proposition's future. Well, to dive into this and more legal shenanigans, we're once again joined by constitutional lawyer, man about town, and host of the Uprising podcast, Mr. Scott D. Cosenza, Esquire. Welcome back, Scott.
Hi, Mark. Pleasure to be here.
So the 51st state, what's the latest development in the push?
There is no 51st state. There is unlikely to be a 51st state anytime soon. The Supreme Court rejected an appeal from a group of activists who have been trying to get court recognition that they should be entitled to vote for Congress. These are people who live in the District of Columbia and claim that their rights to be represented in Congress by being able to vote for a fully credentialed member of Congress is violated. There is a Representative Delegate Eleanor Holmes Norton who is allowed to do some things in Congress, but she's not a full member because that's not what the Constitution provides. And the justices tossed it out of court. This was not, it's important to recall, not a full hearing. The justices did not grant this argument the purchase of a really strong legal argument. These people have lost it at every level, and now they will not be heard by the Supreme Court.
Well, that's the thing, right? It seems quite ludicrous when it's apparent to everybody that this is about gaining an inbuilt advantage in Congress for Democrats. That's the root of it, and it's quite silly to argue otherwise, I'd guess. But those extra seats, should they materialize, they are going straight to the Dems. But why isn't the argument being made about just handing the land that doesn't hold the government buildings within Washington, D.C., back to Maryland, who gifted it to the United States government in the first place on the condition that it wouldn't become a voting area? Wouldn't that just solve the issue?
They don't want it. With the exception of a couple of gorgeous neighborhoods in D.C. where high-end staffers and the sort live, D.C. has, a lot of horrible areas, a lot of areas that are real ghetto and have insanely high numbers of dysfunction, violence, homicides, and every other problem. Maryland doesn't want those D.C. neighborhoods, and neither does Virginia.
All right. One of the stories that I find particularly fascinating this week that you brought to my attention was that of the New York drinking straw law, which will fine businesses for giving out unsolicited straws and also for not having enough straws. Now, bear with me a moment here, Scott. So they can be fined for giving out straws unsolicited, but they can also be fined for not having enough straws for the people who solicit.
Will be, R2B, Mark.
R2B.
Yes.
So this seems both ludicrous and contradictory. What's your professional take?
That is it.
Ludicrous and contradictory. There you go. That will hold up in the next court of law.
They hate business so much in New York. It's just a miracle that anything gets done there. That you've laid it out perfectly. They have to have straws on hand for anybody who requests them, and absolutely cannot give straws or indicate they have straws to give to people who don't request them. And it's a fine to give somebody a straw who hasn't requested one. It's a fine to ask somebody why they want a straw if they request one, and also to not have one on hand for them. And yet, Mark, they also have to have special receptacles designed to dispose of the straws and the other straws that they're supposed to have on hand, which are these recyclable straws. They're required and to have a special receptacle for those. And any failure to meet them will result in fines. And of course, it's going to be low-hanging fruit for the city inspectors in New York to just walk into any place, that hasn't gotten the memo yet. They get a drinking straw with their drink, and now the business owner has fines.
So it wasn't announced in the national news that New York had solved all of its crime, debt, homelessness, and drug addiction problems, so they could start dealing on this. Why wasn't that covered in the papers, Scott?
You know what? I love that, and also reject it entirely. And what I mean by that is this isn't a problem that should even be gotten to if there were no crime in New York. The idea that somehow it's entirely based on the false notion. There was a child who produced this drinking straw, quote unquote, study, and I really shouldn't even use that words, that disclosed how many drinking straws were thrown away in this country. And it grossly overestimated by a geometric factor, which kind of motivated these drinking straw bans. Meanwhile, the amount of plastic that it contributes to, sort of our waste load or in the oceans or whatever is absolutely minuscule. The science doesn't support it. It's just another attempt for people to feel good about doing something and imposing a burden on business owners.
Well, shame on them for opening businesses in New York. No, I'm not going to finish with that line. Well, we'll say cheers to the hearty business owners of New York who have to put up with this thing on a daily basis. Scott DeCosenta, thank you ever so much.
Thank you, Mark.
Right after this short break, we're going to be talking with Carrie Lucas, who is the managing director of the Independent Women's Forum, finding out where's the pushback against CRT and race-based teaching in America. We see the Department of Justice and the FBI being tasked with rooting out parents who criticize school boards. Labels of domestic terrorists applied to those who seek nothing more than to have their children educated without political indoctrination. Well, we'll be tackling these issues and many others in just a few moments. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back, right here on Liberty Nation Radio, on the Radio America Network, where truth matters without the spin.
For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
The FBI has been tasked with building a framework to deal with unruly parents who question school boards. Mothers and fathers are furious at what they see as political indoctrination of the young. And with the Biden administration attempting to put billions of dollars into childcare and preschool programs, one wonders what ideological hoops providers may have to jump through. We're fortunate enough to be joined by Carrie Lucas, who's the managing director of Independent Women's Forum, IWF, and a prolific author. Now, Carrie's written a fantastic piece over The Federalist that outlines precisely the threat faced by the educational encroachment. Now, she's here to help us unravel the risks and ramifications of this government push into the education sector. Welcome aboard, Carrie. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So, Carrie, what is the threat as you see it in terms of Joe Biden's multi-billion-dollar investment into schools?
Yeah, I think that everybody should be looking at this money. About $400 billion that they're dangling in front of parents that are supposed to subsidize childcare and daycare, and really wonder what are the strings that are going to come with this money? Because we've seen in other sectors of the economy and certainly in the education system that with big funding comes big strings and basically big government control. And I don't think there's any reason to think that preschool and daycare will be any different.
Yeah, there's a case coming before the Supreme Court this term that looks at how faith-based schools, they've been excluded from certain funding programs. Now, that seems very much the carrot and stick that you're discussing there. There's certain things that they have to do or would be required to do to achieve the funding. So how do you see the future of the faith schools going forward in this argument?
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting because when you look at this, you've got this big debate going on about the quote human infrastructure bill or these $3 trillion really social spending bills that's going on. And there aren't many details when it comes to a lot of the programs and specifically with childcare. Basically, it says they'll be working with the states and handing out money with the intention of making it so all parents, not just poor parents, but get tremendous subsidies for their kids to attend, their kids under age 5, get to attend preschool and daycare. And they don't really say much about what the regulatory scope or how these plans would work. But if you dig just a little bit, if you go back into some of what the White House has written previously about their vision of a preschool program and a daycare program, you start realizing this isn't going to be entirely hands-off. And some of the language they use, and I went kind of looking around, and they talk about the need to have, they talk about having qualified teachers in the schools. Well, that starts already, I'm thinking, like, who gets to decide what the daycare provider needs to be lectured in and what programs they need to have as their background? But then even more disturbingly, they talk about the types of curriculum. And all they say is something like behaviorally or developmentally appropriate. Okay, that sounds okay. And then they say inclusive. And I know from my own battles, I've got 5 kids in public school here, and I live in Virginia, 5 school-age kids. And I know that a lot of those things that sound perfectly fine, developmentally appropriate, inclusive, really are code words for doing really weird stuff in our public schools, including CRT and kind of this tremendous focus on race and really racial identity as something that kids should fixate on. And the developmentally appropriate is often things that as a parent, I think is really too early to introduce when it comes to sexuality issues and even gender identity. So I think parents should be looking at this and saying, if this is the only way for me to get subsidies is to go into a school that is going to do what they want on these issues. That means my choices are going to be pretty limited. And especially for some of the schools that say they don't want to do what they do, they're going to be going out of business.
Yeah, we've heard a lot about CRT, critical race theory, in recent years, and there've been just as many denials that it's taking place as there have been stories about the tenets that it's teaching or that are reinforcing the education behind it. So what is the reality? Are these stories, are they out of proportion, or is there an effort to rename and reframe critical race theory so that parents can't really catch hold of the issue or understand the narrative?
Yeah, and I do think that it's one of those. It's almost become like a code word, and it doesn't always perfectly capture what we're talking about. I know I use it basically with this whole idea of the schools like fixating on race. And obviously, I think that you always need to kind of start this conversation with like, of course, I think we should be entirely inclusive. We should teach about the history of America and our troubled past with slavery and with racism. Those are all very legitimate topics. But what we're talking about, and I see this on the public schools, is that we're not talking about that. We're not talking about like an honest evaluation of kind of our American journey or the journey of the Western world in terms of our improvements in race relations. What they're focused on is talking about how today, basically racism is the fundamental the structure under which everything should be understood. And the thing that I find most disturbing, and especially when I think about how this could morph down to preschool, is thinking about how to think about yourself. And about your role and really your responsibilities, because my kids are all white, and I don't want them to grow up thinking that means that they're bad, that they're different, that they have to almost worry about how they interact with kids of other colors, white or whatever. Like that, this shouldn't be the defining thing that they should be thinking about. And I do worry that that's what's happening in K through 12 today. And that's how it will come. And they're not going to start, with like serious texts about critical race theory or whatever. But this mentality, this race first, will definitely infect preschools and daycare centers if the government is put in charge.
Yes, it seems that it's the idea of putting one group as the oppressed and one group as the oppressor, literally based on their skin color. But of course, we have seen talk of the oppressed and the oppressor before. I believe was it Karl Marx?
There you go.
I think
Absolutely.
it was.
Yeah.
How strange. What a coincidence. So what areas of teaching does this, let's call it backdoor or code word indoctrination, impact? I mean, is it just certain courses or curricula, or is it spread wider and inherent in each curricula?
I think that it is increasingly, it's the starting place for education, and increasingly in America. And certainly I think that's the thing that worries me about preschools, that it does become like a frame that everything is discussed through. And I don't think that's what parents want. And the main thing, it's interesting, because one thing I think that when we have these conversations where the left wants to say that we're on the side, or that the people who are opposing this, that we want to like shut down conversations. And I don't. I think that parents, and that's why I don't support outlawing critical race theory. I think that I just want parents to have choice. And the problem with a program like what we're going to see, if the federal government becomes involved in daycare, and they become the one who is able to certify daycare centers and where you're allowed to go and receive these subsidies, suddenly that becomes the default choice, as it is with public school. Obviously with public schools in America, I could, if I had a ton of money, I would then shop around and send my kids to pay for the tuitions, $20,000 in many cases for high school tuition here in the United States. But if you can't afford that, that you end up at whatever it is that the government serves up. And that's how it's going to be in preschool. If you want these government subsidies, you will be in a government sanctioned preschool. And just to play off your Karl Marx thing, because it's easy to kind of, we're being so ridiculous, that's way over the top. I do think that people should be aware, it's not just Marx. It's not just the whole Nazi Hitler youth thing. We see this around the world today. We see this in China. We've seen it in Venezuela. You see how governments know that teaching what is taught is central to the future of the country. And I do think as Americans, in the same way, I think there's a lot of people on the left who would say, gosh, I don't want whatever they see as the crazy boogeyman on the right. They shouldn't want them making curriculum decisions. Well, I don't want them making curriculum decisions, so we don't need to argue about this. We can say, get government out of our schools and our education system, and certainly don't get them in to teaching my preschoolers.
Yeah, I think this issue has really come to light during the COVID shutdowns and pandemic. Well, the shutdown specifically. I mean, a lot of parents were quite shocked to find out what was going on in their kids' classrooms, what was being taught, when they could actually see it via the Zoom teaching sessions, as it were. The lockdown provided a very rare glimpse into the classroom. In essence, it allowed them to see behind the curtain, and they weren't happy. Now, you wrote in the article that you put up on the Federalist that the lack of in-person schooling can be highly damaging, especially to special needs kids from low-income backgrounds. But isn't it also true that it's now become a balancing act of concern for parents? I mean, they have to weigh up the indoctrination versus the benefits of in-person schooling, right?
Oh, absolutely. And I do think you're absolutely right. If you think about the silver lining of COVID, and I found at home school or doing virtual school was, I thought it was a disaster. I know I don't want to speak anecdotally, but I did have 5 kids who were logging on, and it was incredibly mind-numbing. You think as a parent, I'd always been really focused on trying to limit my kids' time spent on screens, because I do want them to have that fundamental learn how to interact with other people, especially kids their age. And they lacked that. But you're right that we did see all of a sudden that the teachers I trusted to just be interested in teaching my kids kind of those core skills and to be good citizens and to kind of provide that framework for education, that often they do have a different agenda. And it was very surprising to me to see what was being served up. Not all, some of this kids' teachers were great, but some were obviously had a different agenda. And what we see now, you're right, a lot of parents are now taking their kids out of school and finding new solutions. I just think the important thing is that parents should have more control, it shouldn't be an all or nothing. I'm either, going to homeschool my kid and have them in my house and be in charge of them, or send them to a school where there is going to be this leftist and really fundamentally, I think, racially charged, even, I think it's fairly racist, a lot of what's being taught now. We shouldn't be left with that. We can do better. Parents should have more leverage and more say and more options.
Well, let's talk about those options briefly. So final question, if I may, Carrie. Now, we love to find solutions here on Liberty Nation Radio rather than just repeating the litany of miseries, which are unfortunately so often here. But what is the solution?
Yeah, and I'm a big believer that money should follow parents. And I do think, it's interesting, as a conservative and as somebody who often questions government's role in our lives, it doesn't mean that I don't think that the government shouldn't help some parents who are really struggling with childcare costs. A lot of times daycare can be very expensive, and we should be targeting help, support, tax credits and whatnot, to help parents who do need support, but they should control that. And it shouldn't be the government who gets to decide what childcare situation. Frankly, it shouldn't be the government that says you have to send that child to an official institutional daycare. If grandma can do it, if the nice lady down the street has 2 kids and is willing, we should find ways and really encourage civil society to provide good ways to support kids. And the good news is when it comes to the education field in particular, K through 12 education, we do see this loosening because so many parents were so disgusted, so motivated, that we see that the grip is loosening a little bit. You have many more people starting to homeschool and finding hybrid homeschools so that they have pods and are working with other parents so kids do have that social interaction. And a growing number of private schools. I know a lot of parents who are similar like me, wow, it would really hurt to have to pay for tuition, who said, forget it, this is too important, and are making enormous financial sacrifices, forgoing vacations, taking out second mortgages so that they can make sure that their kids are in a school that reflects their values. So the battle is out there. And I think the good news is that parents, don't let them call you terrorists. Speak up, because we can change this. We are the majority, not them.
Carrie Lucas, thank you ever so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me on.
And that's about it for this episode of Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I want to thank all of our guests, Andrew Moran, Editor-in-Chief of Liberty Nation, Lisa K. Donner, and Scott Cosenza on our Talking Liberty segment, and for our first-time visitor, Carrie Lucas of the Independent Women's Forum. But most of all, you, the faithful listener, I want to thank you for being here and being part of Team Liberty. I'll leave you with one final thought. Thomas Paine once wrote in one of his letters, "The mind, once enlightened, cannot again become dark." And this, for me, is at the heart of what's happening in schools across the world. there's a push to indoctrinate, not educate. And by doing so, we keep children forever wrapped in a dark cloak of ignorance. They believe that they know all, when really they understand nothing. And this can only be a detriment to them. It's the role of all of us, you and I, everybody, to bring about the enlightenment that they need. The future will never forgive us for leaving them in this dark, dark place. So there is hope, and it comes from you and I, as always. Until next time, thank you for listening. Liberty Nation Radio.